Greetings from panel 4. Hi, this is, we're going to start now, and we're going to start our panel. Let me introduce, well, I guess I should start ladies first, right, Babette? All right. My colleague here at Pepperdine, some of yours teach, what happens, we got a bee in here?
Sorry, it might be me turning off my phone. Sorry, I'm turning it off. Mine's off.
That's you?
No.
Okay. I don't want to have to get tough around here, guys, but I will, you know. So let me introduce my colleague, Babette Bullock, Associate Professor of Law here. She earned her BA with distinction from California State University.
I forgot about that.
And also has a PhD in economics, and clerked for the Honorable Michael B. Mukasey of the U.S. District Court of the Southern District,
He's
and
my
my best friend on the faculty. So I have a real vested interest, and I'm glad that she is here to share this panel, and I'm sure we'll have great and wonderful things to say, as she always does. On my left, Brian Marler, the director of Houlihan Lokey, where he's a member of the Media and Telecom Group, and his experience includes valuing closely held and publicly traded business, and mostly more in the professional sports business, right, Brian?
Correct.
Okay, and my colleague at ESPN, Andrew Brandt, who does all of the business analysis for ESPN, and is also the director of the Villanova Sports Law Institute. And we have traded appearances this year at each of our sports symposium. I was fortunate enough about 3 weeks ago to go back and be a member of his symposium in Villanova. And in return, he gets to, I went to Philadelphia, and in return, he gets to come to Malibu. What's wrong with this picture?
I made a good deal.
Yeah. And of course, on the end is Mark Fanuwada, who's a reporter with ESPN, most noted for his book on Game of Shadows, entitled Game of Shadows, in which he wrote the complete and inside story, if you will, of the Barry Bonds steroid scandal. Mark's an incredibly good reporter and even a better writer. And I consider him also, as I do all of these members of the panel, my friends. So thank you for being here. We're talking about what drives the machine. There's two parts of the college athletics machine. There's academics and there's athletics. So let's think about what drives the machine for a moment. Is it academics or is it athletics, Babette?
Well, thank you, Roger. I like to call this the Friends of Roger panel. Because apparently, Mark, you'll attest to this as well, when your friend Roger, he doesn't give you any clue whatsoever what the actual topic might be. So thanks for starting completely off topic.
Absolutely.
Really well done, and we will be friends for a really long time, I'm sure. So given that this panel is called Broadcast and sort of the money of broadcast, that's a great question. Is it athletics or academics? Is that the question?
So far.
Well, pretty broad question. So I'm going to put it down to an answer that I know, which is that question comes up and has, in the antitrust context, many times. And that's, we've heard it before about whether or not the NC2A, to be cool, apparently that's what you call it. NC2, if you're super cool, I'm not going to go there. So the NC2A has been a lightning rod for antitrust suits over time. In fact, much more so than any of the major leagues. For example, since 1922, if you're counting the cases that have gone to judicial decision, NCAA has gone before the court 31 times out of a total of 83 when you're counting the other major leagues, MLB, NHL, even throwing MLS in there. So definitely a lightning rod, but amateurism has prevailed. Amateurism, out of those 31 cases, 9 have been found outside of antitrust. And why is that important? Because antitrust governs commercial activity. In other words, whether athletics is really going to be this commercial activity or if it's amateur. And it comes out to say, no, it's amateur because the primary focus of the institutions is education. And that's a very strong distinction in the law as opposed to professional leagues. For example, the NBA has only one purpose, and that is to provide a professional sports. So having academics and independent academics, according to antitrust law, has prevailed as sort of the major focus of the institutions. In other words, the question would be, would Harvard exist without Harvard athletics? I think until this particular March Madness, we didn't realize Harvard did have athletics. But aside from that, obviously, the answer is that it would be academics. I know we've talked about it. There is a little Methodist school here in Southern California that came to great power, however, through using athletics. Of course, that is the infamous Methodist school, the Southern California, University of Southern California, USC, as we all know, has really sort of switched that paradigm, and it was really the Trojans that really brought them into focus. So there is a question for certain schools whether or not the predominance of their athletics is what contributes to their academics. But vis-a-vis antitrust law so far, we see a lot of emphasis on this amateur and the academic side.
So I think that what you said, it's athletics rather than academics. Is that in
No, I would say the reverse.
Okay.
It's okay.
Okay. Mark,
but-
Mark Fainuruota, is it time to pay the student athletes?
You know, it's funny, when I first started, first of all, I actually, there's one thing I need to do first. I just want a show of hands. How many either lawyers, law students, or anybody affiliated with the law are in the room? Could somebody just raise their hand? There's like 3 maybe?
4
4 or 5, okay. Because I'm just going to get the crap kicked out of me today. I can just tell you, know that as the one non-lawyer, I think.
Stay, you know.
Good, thank you. When I first started covering sports, I was really vehement about this issue. And I remember having arguments. The first job I had at a college was in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I covered women's basketball and some football. And University of Tennessee football is huge. I mean, it's just it's a religion in the state. And people would talk even then, about the idea of should college athletes be paid. This is hardly a new concept. And I was always very sort of vehement about the notion that, well, no, wait, they're getting a full education. I mean, they're getting 4 years of college. And, when I went to a private school, Northwestern, where I paid a decent chunk of money to go to school, and that was a valuable education. These guys are getting 4 years, and so that's their pay. I since have come full circle, or not full circle, half circle on that, I guess, and I'm now at a point where, after watching sort of the way the industry has evolved, and of course, for my purposes, this is an athletics question, it's not an academic question. It's I think that, as somebody said earlier, the horse has left the barn, and whether these remain academic institutions, which they are, obviously, for the purposes of these discussions, and when you look at NCAA football and NCAA basketball, there's no question that these are billion-dollar industries that are driven largely, frankly, by places like ESPN. So I did a story semi-recently that involved actually the O'Bannon suit that has been talked about a lot. Actually, I think of it as the Keller suit, because actually before it was the O'Bannon suit, it was a suit brought by a guy named Sam Keller, who's a former Arizona State quarterback who ended up at Nebraska. And O'Bannon then sort of jumped in and expanded that suit. But I sat with Keller at one point and played an EA Sports version of college football with him, NCAA football with him. And I sat down to play with him, and we pulled up the Nebraska team that he had played on. And sure enough, there was the quarterback for Nebraska looking exactly the same number, same handedness. Even Sam had started wearing a black visor at Arizona State. He'd never worn one before at Nebraska. He'd never worn one at Arizona State. So EA had put a black visor on him. So the only thing that was not Sam Keller was there was no name on the back of the jersey, because, of course, in the college games on EA, you can't do that, although you can actually get around it and download the names. But so Sam Keller's name and likeness and all of that were effectively being used, but, of course, Sam Keller was not benefiting from that in any way, shape, or form. So for me, that question is sort of moot. I do think there's all sorts of questions that arise around how you would actually make that happen. How do you go about the process of deciding to pay guys? But I think, the idea of figuring out how to compensate and figuring out how to deal with the massive use of their likenesses to benefit the universities and to benefit the NCAA is something that needs to get addressed.
Andrew, the O'Bannon case, the athletic director at Texas said that if the O'Bannon case goes the wrong way, the college football, college sports are over. He sees himself becoming a Division III. University of Texas is going to become a Division III team or a conference and a Division III conference. Do you think that's going to happen?
I think college athletics is going to have to face some issues with litigation. Whether that happens through settlement, whether that happens through depositions, whether it happens through discovery, it's going to have to face this issue. You know, my background is being an agent and working for an NFL team, and what always just struck me every time that I recruited a player, or that we brought in a player, that we scouted a player, is that we really weren't noticing at all what he was doing as a student. That's important, but they have their own measurable for that in football. It's called a Wonderlic test. It really doesn't correlate to what you're doing in your studies at school. We commodify these players. So what's happened on this level, and again, we're talking about the highest level of college athletics, is that man hours, thousands of man hours, millions of dollars are put into scouting these players, looking under every rock, every nook and cranny to find the best players. How they do as a student, that's nice. It's nice to know they're good students, but that's a small, if not minuscule, part of the overall scouting process. So we have become where we commodify these players. Now it comes to whether like an O'Bannon case or something like that actually puts that to the test, where we're not really talking about academics versus athletics, we're talking about academics versus athletics / money. I mean, if you're an athletic director at a university, I guess if you were looking at it in purely academic terms, you have 20 sports, you have 23 sports, you have all the women's sports, you have the non-revenue sports, and you have, if you're a big-time school, basketball and football. If you're looking at it in terms of dollars, you're looking at basketball and football, and that's about it. I think the point that can be made on behalf of academia in NCAA is that these schools do not just have football and basketball. So every school we talk about that has these issues where people are making so much money for the university, they also have 10, 12, 15, 20, 25 other sports that don't make that money. So again, when you start talking about O'Bannon, you bring in the corollary subject of paying athletes, which, again, we can figure it out. They're smart people. But think about the logistics involved in there and the people that do not produce a dime of revenue for the university. Should they get paid? Should a third-string tackle get paid? Should a star women's volleyball get paid even though they're losing money? Those kind of things would have to be factored into all of this. Beyond it all, of course, is litigation, and it's a long way off with the O'Bannon case. But I think that it's naive to say that college athletics at the level we're talking about is about academics. It's gone way beyond that.
Brian, I know your particular expertise is in professional sports, but in terms of college sports, in terms of financial, broadcast rights are causing incredible pressures on college sports. We're seeing realignments, we're seeing new conferences, mostly because of a grab for the dollar.
Yep.
Your comments on that?
Yeah, and just a little background on myself. I do focus on valuing professional sports franchises as well as regional sports networks in the context of transactions, for tax planning, for ownership and whatnot. And we deal a lot with those regional sports networks and looking at the benefits of creating your own RSN or taking the media rights. And what do? Whether it's college sports or in professional sports. And there's a number of decisions to be made. One is the trade-off, again, of what rights can I receive if I do a third-party television rights deal versus creating my own sports network. And if you're going to create your own network, well, am I still going to license, let's say, my Tier 1 and Tier 2 rights to an ESPN or a Fox to be broadcast, and then I'm only going to air, let's say, Tier 3 rights, which maybe aren't the best games or at the best times. And again, what kind of rights am I giving up versus what type of affiliate fees I could receive. So if you have your own sports network, effectively, you're going to have to develop the content or find a partner and do some sort of joint venture that has the expertise to broadcast that network. And then you're going to have to go out to the various MSOs and direct broadcast satellite operators, your Comcast, your DirecTV, and get carriage. And you're going to ask for so much per subscriber per month for those rights. And that operator, that MSO, is going to have to make the decision, do I want to carry you or not? So you look at the Pac-12 network, they've gotten a lot of carriage. They've done a great deal of getting that carriage. I'm a USC graduate. I have DirecTV. I can't watch those USC games because DirecTV hasn't entered into an agreement yet. You know, you could argue that if you read some of the press and what's out there, DirecTV is thinking, well, do I need the Pac-12 network? Am I going to lose my subscribers if I don't carry the Pac-12 network? It's a trade-off there. Are they going to pay those affiliate fees, or are they going to lose subscribers based on the popularity of that network? So you look at some conferences, and they've actually have gone defunct because they've lost some of those teams. So you think about teams going to other conferences. If a number of the top teams within that conference leave, well, do you have enough draw to keep your carriage with Comcast, Time Warner, DirecTV, whoever it may be? And that's a big issue there. On the professional side, there's even more things to think about, and that's being the revenue sharing situation. So if you're a YES Network or a New England Sports Network, and now with the Dodgers' new deal, how much of that revenue potentially am I going to have to share with the other teams if I'm a top revenue producing team? And in terms of Major League Baseball, they're going to make sure that if you own the Major League team as well as the network, that's an arm's length transaction to make sure there is revenue sharing. And we've actually been involved in situations where we've gone in and done a market check on those rights fees to make sure they are at arm's length, to make sure the revenue sharing is accurate. So a lot of opportunities there. You could say in the professional world, there's been a number of very successful regional sports networks. And in some cases, the RSN can be worth much more than the team. But at the collegiate level, you just need to make sure, one, you have the draw, you can get the carriage, and either enter into a joint venture or really have the operational expertise to make that a successful network.
Andrew, we work for a company that has changed the face of college athletics. The amount of money that ESPN has brought to the table has had a great deal of influence, from starting from the number of games that are played to starting times to what nights they're played, et cetera. I asked you earlier about time to pay players, and your answer was because of the enormous amount of money, and your answer was not so much that we shouldn't pay them, but it's a difficult formula to figure out whether to pay them or how to pay them. Am I right? Would you agree with me that it's time to pay them as opposed to it's difficult to figure out how to pay them?
I'm going to give a typical ESPN answer. I don't know.
Wait, no one ever told me we're allowed to say that on the network.
Yeah, I never get to say
No
that.
one's allowed to say
It may
I
be
don't
the
know.
truth,
I meant
but
it
I never get to
untypical.
say it.
I'm conflicted because I think that, you know, from a visceral sense in the economy of sports and the business of sports and the money they create, and I understand seeing the jerseys in the bookstore, I get that. But I'm conflicted because of, A, what I talked about earlier, because we're all talking about such a small slice of the athletic community in college, just a tiny little sliver of who these players are that bring in all the money. And I'm also conflicted because, yes, I do have those ideals still in my head about student athletics, and it's not about the money. Even though whenever anyone says it's not about the money, of course that means it's all about the money. I think that if we take aside the big tickets, then we can come up with a model that these guys are paid and they are taken outside of the academic community. Now, that is a radical subject because obviously they're there to be students, but the question becomes, what are these guys brought to the university for? And what I can get concerned about when I see this sort of, like I say, the commodification of big-time athletics in colleges, I get concerned is that early on, there are people being brought to universities that are not prepared to be there. And early on in their academic career, they realize their major is going to be eligibility. They're going to take whatever they need to take to stay eligible, rather than taking what they need to go on to a career in something, to go on and study, to have a learning process throughout their time. So for that segment of the community, and it's probably more than we think, we should take them out of it. We should have an athletic community within the academic system. They're there for athletics. Because when you have these players moving to, early on in their careers, I've seen this, they move on to be, like I said, major in eligibility. What's the easiest course to take? What's the path to stay eligible? And then again, a final note, bringing it to the NFL. What happens with players that finish their college in November or December, it's over. They don't even come back. So if they sign with agents, they're off to the agent place to start preparing for the combine. Then it's pro days, then it's the draft, then it's training to get with their team. So by Thanksgiving, if they're not in bowl games, they're gone. It's a rare athlete that stays around as an NFL prospect. And they may have not only a semester left, but they may have years left to graduate. So for that community, again, it's not working. There's an academic model that's not part of their educational experience. So for that, again, I'm hedging, but for that group, I would take it out. For the rest of college athletes, they are students. They are student athletes.
Professor Bullock, you and I have had conversations regarding this. Is it time for college athletes to be paid, or would you say that they already are being compensated?
Well, first I want to just play off of a little bit of what both Brian and Andrew said. I mean, it's an interesting concept because really when you look at the revenues that come in, the revenues are broadcast. When people say, where's the money for student athletics, what they're talking about are exactly what Brian talked about. It's the broadcast deals. And to be more precise, it's actually the telecast deals. Broadcast has a specific legal meaning, actually. And so it's these telecast contracts, and in those telecast contracts, it's really Division I men's basketball and football. That's where the complication comes in within the academic community that Andrew pointed out, not the least of which is Title IX. And how do you deal with that? It's an interesting concept Andrew's presented, and I think with Brian talking about the rise of RSNs, regional sports networks, arguably you could sort of peel off what exactly is the revenue portion of these Division I men's basketball and men's football, but then how do you deal with the other academic provisions such as Title IX, and how do you distribute it? It does become very complicated very quickly, but I do think it's technically possible. As to the follow-up that Roger was referring to, whether or not,
whether or not they are paid or they're already being paid.
Well, there is an argument, obviously, that their scholarship money, as you mentioned before, Mark, is that the scholarship money is payment for it. I would differentiate that there are different rights. For example, the post-play video rights, which came out in O'Banion, is an interesting case because it does seem not to be directly connected with the play that the scholarship is paying for. So it does seem to perhaps be a little bit more unique property right that could be separated from that, and so I will give you that. Also, an O'Banion case has arisen, the archival tapes, who has the property rights to that. That has already been established in league play to belong to the team. So if we were to do that by analogy, maybe it goes to the institution. Again, we're just talking about historical playback. Again, I think that's different than video, which is recreating the person. in putting them in situations that they weren't in. So I do think that's more an expansive property right that maybe should be individually negotiated. So putting that aside for a second, the economics breaks down that actually scholarships, or at least the opportunity to exercise a full scholarship, whether you do so or not, is actually quite valuable. The different cases that, the different ways of allocating the broadcast revenues that have come forward in O'Banion, basically, arguably, are less than the scholarship money. So if you were to have an either or, you get sort of the slice of the broadcast pie, or you get the scholarship, depending on your institution, you'd be better off taking the scholarship economically. So there is a valid argument that it is actually a very valuable consideration that you're being given. More important, to speak to Andrew's point, is not just the opportunity to finish the education, whether you exercise that or not, it's the opportunity to be in a position where you can be scouted. It's more efficient, and you know that. That's why you try and get into a team like a Notre Dame or someone else where you have high visibility, or perhaps where you'll be played more. So again, that's an opportunity that you're being compensated for. So I do think we already have some compensation with the scholarship that we shouldn't undervalue. But I do think there are a lot of other individual rights that seem to be tossed into that we could extract really easily and give to the player.
Mark, the enormous amount of money that college football gets, the teams that win the most are the ones that are the most on television, the ones that we know the most. Those really are because of the players. I can't think of another financial model in which that kind of talent doesn't have the ability to receive remuneration, or at least negotiate for remuneration. I want to keep coming back to it because I think it's, personally, I think it's time. Your thoughts?
It's a loaded question, isn't it? I mean, I said earlier, I think that in spite of all the sort of various complications about trying to figure out a method, that something needs to change clearly. And I mean, the idea that we're still, I know, again, as we know, I'm no lawyer, and this what I'm about to say isn't necessarily relevant when we're going to get into court, but the idea that we're even having a conversation anymore about amateurism is ludicrous to me. I mean, it's just like all we have to do is see the amount of money. I mean, we're not having conversations about volleyball. We're not having conversations about tennis or lacrosse. These are billion-dollar industries funded largely by the networks. And then the more they win, the more money they get, whether they're for winning BCS championships or for winning national championships. So the idea that like the conversation somehow still revolves around a question of amateurism for me, and whether the NCAA can argue that, seems folly to me. I just don't even get it anymore. That when people start making that argument to me, I have no sort of like use for it, because I just don't think it may be relevant for the law, and that's obviously sort of where we're going to proceed. But I think it's not a real argument in terms of the practical matter of what's happening in college sports right now. And so to that point, while I agree, as I said at the onset, it's certainly valuable to get an education, obviously. And there's a certain amount of money that's assigned to that. That's clearly not accommodating what's happening in sports. And I think the two things about that are interesting. One, in one of the earlier panels today, somebody pointed out that yes, you're getting an education, but there's a cap to that, obviously. So there is no sort of free market in that. And these are marketable commodities, clearly. So there's no free market in that. It's whatever the tuition is, that's the cap. But the other piece of that too is and I think this was talked about in one of the earlier panels, is there's no, these student athletes have two jobs, basically, two full-time jobs. They have a full-time job as an athlete. I mean, I don't care what the limits are on practice times. If you talk to any college athlete and look at at least the top levels, what they're doing a full-time job by competing as athletes. It's just, there's no way around it. Between meetings, practices, travel, training, all of it, that is a 40-hour-a-week job easily. There's just no way around it. So the idea that somehow they're then supposed to be academic students as well, which any of us know who've gone to a school and tried to get through college or all that, despite how much we might have partied, know that it's not exactly an easy task. So I think clearly there's a compensation model that needs to come into play. But again, I have no idea what that is. I recognize the complications for it, but I just think we've left that question behind now, and the point is figuring out how to do it. And I don't know. I know that on the issue of likenesses and that point, you know, one of the arguments from the Keller lawsuit is that Keller O'Bannon suit is that, you know, let's put aside a trust fund and we'll set up a trust, and that some of that money will be allotted once kids are out of college, and you know, you can give them that money. But in terms of the current student athlete, how you set up the model, I don't know. But I think Andrew's idea of separating at least gets us closer to that.
One thing about the time, just to chime in what Mark said about time, is one thing I noticed at the Packers when people came in from colleges is just the enormous amount of time they felt they had. And these are now saying it as pros versus when they were in college. They just, and that was a problem for us. When you give these guys too much time, that's obviously a problem. Money and time is not a good mix. But they would, I just hear people talk about, well, you know, so practice is done at, you know, 2 o'clock. What do I do now? Well, you go home. You know, we'll see you tomorrow. Really? I mean, that's it? Because in college, you know, we did this, and we did training table, and we did that, and we, you know, it was just like, and none in that schedule was kind of study or classes. It was just this constant requirement to be there. And the other thought that continues to hit me, both as an agent and a team guy, and Jeff knows this from being an agent, is just how sometimes so unprepared guys are with life skills. And this is the really unfortunate part, because a lot of them don't, you know, make the pros and have ability to make money. There's no safety net. Just simple tasks. And part of it is because they didn't apply themselves, but part of it is because there was some coddling going on by coaching staffs, by tutors, by all the resources in play for these top college programs. You know, I remember just telling a guy, okay, so you write a check to so-and-so. He's like, well, what's that? What's that mean, write a check? You know, 24 years old from a very established college. Had no idea what that was. And so this is sort of beyond the study part of it. Because they are commodities, they're taken care of. And that can lead to negative consequences later.
Haven't we, hasn't the universities accepted that with one and done? I mean, one and done, isn't one and done really saying, okay, come on by, stick around for a while, you don't have to be a student. You really, in fact, you can withdraw before anything happens to you, and just play a little, in this case, basketball. So if that's the case, and as Mark says, I reject the word amateurism, aren't we really talking about professionals, Professor Bullock?
Well, in some ways, my point was not to argue amateurism. That has legal significance when it comes to antitrust treatment, and has and still has to be dealt with one way or the other. But my point is, no, they are being compensated, which is what you would expect for some professional athletes. We're just quibbling about money. So I do think that full scholarship is an acknowledgement by the universities that this is a commodification, that this is a payment for play. So what your point is and the cap that you brought up, Mark, is very interesting, is that basically, I think your point is that you're not differentiating between skill levels of players? Was that your point?
Yeah, and
the cap is all equal pay, basically.
Effectively, I mean, you don't have an opportunity to make more than somebody else. Basically.
Right, sort of like the draft choices, right? You know, in your first couple years of rookie years and other times that you're drafted in, at least with one and done, you're allowing them to go into the legal faster to recoup the money, if you will, which I think again is an acknowledgement that it's a commodification in some ways. It's liberalizing the restraint on them. There are very unique issues between when you look at it legally from, are we talking about the NC2A or are we talking about individual institutions or conferences? And you actually are going to get different legal treatment depending on what you're looking at. And I think what's going to be really interesting are the RSNs of conference play. And that's going to be a real interesting development.
Explain what an RSN is.
The regional sports networks are very fascinating because recently, as we go from pure broadcast, now those of you ordered over the age of 25 or 30 understand what broadcast is. That's just NBC, CBS, our big networks. Those are broadcast free over the air with bunny ears, remember? But when we switched everything to digital and we have ESPN and we have satellite, we have Dish, we have cable networks, and now we have internet, we have changed the telecast market tremendously. So our development of cable networks especially have gone exponential on regional sports networks. A network is often several channels on your dial, or to use the old language, remember when we had dials? So several channels. So you literally, this is what my point to Andrew and Brian, you literally could say Longhorn Network or Big 12 Network, and two of the actual channels will be dedicated to Division I basketball and Division I football. You could literally differentiate it if you needed to because the technology is now there. So it's possible to follow the revenue stream and attribute it. So it's becoming easier to do what they're suggesting than it has in the past. So I do think that's going to be an interesting explosion because the money that's associated with specific programs will become more and more identifiable, which makes the allocation problem much more clear-cut. So these arguments that we should allocate it according to the sport and revenue generation is going to become a bit more clear as we go along.
And then, sorry to interrupt, and I'm not an expert in paying for amateur sports at all, but do you also have any issues with parity among the different
That's
conferences? If not everyone's going to make the same amount of money to play, then is everyone going to go to the bigger markets? Just think of Major League Baseball and the Yankees. Do they get the better players? And you lose the parity that maybe the NFL has because they share the media rights equally. And then you go back and say, well, if that wage is going to be equal across all colleges, can you really do that with small market universities that don't have the support, whether it be the ticket sales or the suites or whatever it may be?
But you already have that anyway.
You have that.
I mean, you have that inequality anyway, right? In the way the conferences are set up and in
Within
the
the
way they continue to
conferences.
expand, in the way they continue to expand and
Right.
within
Within each conference, but then if you're moving away conference to conference,
No, but
do
I
you
mean-
get any issues there?
But
That's
even
all I'm
there, you
asking.
still have it, right? I mean, you've got, no one's comparing the Southwest, well, the Southwest Conference doesn't exist. No one's comparing I won't even discourage, I won't rip on any conference. No one's
Right.
comparing some bad conference to the SEC or the ACC. I mean, so,
But I'm just saying, is there any different in economics between the SEC, the Big 12, the Pac-12, that's going to, where players are going to gravitate to one area, or it makes it more different for that university to make that pay scale compared to a different, or a private university, let's say a Notre Dame?
But is this a good reason not to pay because there's all of these problems that they have to deal with universities getting incredible amounts of money from regional sports networks and other ways of broadcasting income? I mean, is that an argument to say, well, it gets really complex and it gets really tough to figure this out, and therefore we shouldn't do it? It does get tough to figure this out. Is that a reason to say we shouldn't do it?
I don't think it's a reason to say we shouldn't do it. Everything I'm hearing is what I cover sort of pro sports. I mean, what we're talking about here is developing a system almost like a collective bargaining system, but there's no union involved.
Right.
So we have a salary cap to try to encourage equality, to try and encourage level playing field for recruiting these guys. So we have some kind of, maybe you have to stay a couple of years instead of one and done. You put in all these things. And we seem to be headed towards the model that pro leagues have, which requires, of course, unionization to get a labor antitrust exemption. Labor exemption. So that's kind of just my thought here, is what we're doing is we're really coming up with a system. Again, logistics shouldn't be the reason you don't do it, but the system is going to look very much like a pro system. And I guess my final point is when you start talking about these things, I know athletics departments and universities have the same response, which is, we can't afford it. We can't afford it. On the other hand, they afford the things they need to afford. $1 million, multi-million dollar coaching staffs, multi-million dollar athletic facilities. So sometimes that excuse, if you will, does seem to fall on deaf ears when they're spending so much in other areas of athletics.
You know, I should be a member of this panel rather than the moderator, but let me just put I guess what I'm suggesting is,
Go for it.
I guess what I'm suggesting is
You want to
this.
switch?
Yeah. I guess what I'm suggesting is this, is that the model of college football changed when television came in. And that it changed from, you know, what I like to remember is the good old days, you know, how great it was. I mean, there was a time when there wasn't 100 games a weekend. Until it was the game of the week. And that was, if your team was on, that was a big deal. But college football, television changed that. And I think what television did is make the universities go from an amateur, or at least arguably an amateur group of amateurs, to professionalism, and we ask the athletes to do so much more. The panel before us was talking about how it's a full-time job now. 14 games for many athletes. 14 games of football. Summers, they used to give them the summers off. Now they have to train all summer. I think it's now, I guess what my argument is that it's we can't think of it as amateur, and we have to think of it as professional. And if we do think of it as professional, why doesn't the free market reign here? And yes, I understand that means that maybe some teams will go out of business or Division III will increase. But what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that?
I don't think anything's wrong. I mean, I think actually there's large agreement at the table about it. I think that just the question is how are you going to work it out? But I think it is a question of sort of money distribution, as Professor said. It's not, but of course all of this is it's a wonderful conversation to have. But of course the NCAA, apparently at this point, has no interest whatsoever in that. So we're not going to make that call for them clearly. And so again, I've said this from the start. I don't have any. I agree with you, Roger, and that's not often happening, I think, for us. But I agree with you, but I don't, and it being difficult is not a reason not to do it. But the question's going to be how is it going to get implicated, implemented, who's going to implement it, who's going to force it to be implemented. It's going to require an acceptance that the model needs to change by NCAA presidents. And as much as we hear talk about the model needing to change, it's not like you see radical change happening. So I think there's the sort of fantasy conversation we have about it happening, and then the very pragmatic and real one, which is who actually is going to make it happen, who's going to force it to happen, and is it going to require, unionization by players at the college level, and that going to court and seeing where that happens? Is it going to be the Keller O'Bannon case that changes the face of it? Is it going to be these concussion suits that are now looming for the NCAA? I mean, to me, as a reporter, selfishly, this is the best thing that's happening right now, is the spate of litigation that's going on that the NCAA is having to face is not only fascinating, but it's fodder for change and all the things that sort of we hope for and that are interesting.
It's not so bad for legal analysts either.
I bet it's not.
And lawyers.
And lawyers. And lawyers. Let me just think about a second. But, what I've said to you...
Always picks on me.
And the reason is because you and I have had conversations about O'Bannon. You believe, as I understand it, that it's compensation enough and that there really isn't a need for more. And, well, let me go ahead. Instead of saying what you say what you say. And for a change, let you say it.
Yeah, for a change. But, so I'm going to completely ignore your question and answer my own.
What else is new? Yeah.
Exactly. It's a good old professor trick, because I wanted to pick up on what both Mark and Andrew said about unionization. I find that fascinating. And the reason I find that fascinating is because when you look at the very old history of the NC2A, in its own proclamation, and we've heard from the NC2A, it has started out to protect the college athletes' health and welfare. If that doesn't sound like the goal of a players' union, I don't know what does, right? It has started out with that. The problem is, because of this mix with athletics and amateurism into the mix, and then antitrust law that doesn't like broad associations. They like, well-organized, very clear, defined governance. They will treat that differently. That the NC2A, and many people talked about, suffers from sort of antitrust, lightning rod things. Players' unions do not, because players' unions enjoy, of course, the labor exemptions. You see? So it is fascinating to me to think about where the NC2A is strongest, where it wins against antitrust again and again, is when it is most clearly talking about player eligibility rights. Again, exactly the kind of things that you would find a players' union arguing in a collective bargaining agreement. And that, to me, is a fascinating thing, because would it not be better, perhaps the next move, like you said, Mark, of the NC2A is to actually be a union, to actually act more like a union, perhaps at a conference level rather than across the entire front. I don't know what it would look like, but then a lot of these problems would go away. Like you said, Andrews, then you could actually argue it. You're outside of sort of antitrust, arguably, and have the CBA feel, because CBA, of course, protects players. So I do think it's a fascinating way to maybe restructure and be more effective protection for the players. That could also cover sort of O'Banion issues, because of course they would deal with those directly and really ex ante figure out what the compensation was and the post-term rights, as CBAs do. So I do think it's a very fascinating proposal.
It's interesting you say that with the NCAA, because a lot of what we talk about in sports law is power of the commissioner, and there's been great, in the past year with the bounties, with the NBA stuff and the Chris Paul trade or non-trade, the commissioner power has been very much in the news. So when we talk about commissioner power in pro sports, now we drill down to college sports, we talk about the NCAA. And the study of the commissioner, the ideal, what we all hope the commissioner to be, is someone that looks out for the best interests of the game. What it has become is someone that looks out for the best interests of the owners, which is much different than looking out for the best interests of the game in total, and includes the players. Now you start talking about the NCAA. Are they looking out for the best interests of the players? Well, that's how they're designed, but are they becoming someone that's associated with looking out for the best interests of the owners, which I guess would be the presidents, schools, which may be antithetical to the best interest of the players, at least where it comes to this idea of business of college sports. So it's just a thought when you start talking about what the NCAA is designed to protect. One quick thought about what Mark said, because I think what we're all trying to figure out is, what's the inflection point? What is that tipping point that's going to take this to a pay-for-play model? And I don't know, but it's interesting, it's sort of happened at the conference level, right? So the Big East of 5 months ago had all these members, and over the past few years, there were all these thoughts about adding schools, and I heard a conversation where, you'll like this, Gabe, where Tulane was brought up. And the presidents are like, hey, Tulane's great. What an incredible academic institution. We'd love to have them. Then it gets to the coaches. They're like, no way, they stink. We're football. They stink. We don't want Tulane. So then you figure out, what's the role here? What are these conferences designed to do? What are these schools designed to do? And now we saw the break-off. The break-off of schools that weren't beholden to football. The Marquettes and Villanovas and Georgetowns, et cetera, forming their own conference, which is now called the Big East. And so the conferences have done this. They have taken this point where Mark's talking about. Now we see, can it happen with the players? It's much harder, but we'll see.
The conferences are, what we're watching is the breakup of conferences. And the reason the conferences break up is financial reasons. Is it reasonable to think that maybe 5, 10 years from now, there's only going to be 2 conferences, one on the East and one on the West, of all the best teams, and they'll play each other? Wouldn't that solve all the problems?
You're not talking much down there. Go ahead.
I don't do college. I walked in the wrong door.
I mean, I'll take it if you want.
Yeah, it's all yours.
I mean, that's the, when you read all the pundits, that's what they say is going to happen, right? You're going to end up with, 2 super conferences. And we almost ended up there, at least to some degree, when you looked at the Pac-10, now the Pac-12. But when you looked at the potential merger with the Big 12. So, and you were looking at, I think if you look at the emails and documents that came out of that case, you were looking at 24-team conference or something like that, and then discussion of the similar kind of thing on the East Coast. But I mean, that consolidates the power, obviously, in ways, but granted, I don't totally track all of this, but I never saw that as a solution necessarily to sort of eliminating where we're at. I think it's interesting. I want to ask you this because I'm not tracking. The idea. Are you suggesting on the union point that the idea would be the NCAA itself would become the union and would thus represent players, and then and then the presidents would then be off on their own? Because when I talk about it, I'm talking about in the context of the players unionizing themselves
Right.
separately.
Absolutely.
Because the NCAA is the institutions right now. It's not the athletes, whether it wants to say it is or not. So you'd either have to change
Exactly.
and force the NCAA to address and become this athlete's
Or-
advocate, or
Have a collective bargaining agreement by the union, by the players themselves.
and the players would have their
Totally
own
separate.
union. Right.
Absolutely, which
Right.
deals with, as Andrew said, it's unclear what the direction is sometimes of the NCAA, especially on issues like this with opinion.
And then if you have a super conference, back to media rights,
Right.
are those split on a national basis like the NFL?
Right.
Or does every school negotiate their own rights like Major League Baseball? And again, back to parity, how does that affect the smaller market teams versus large market teams? And then if you're paying those athletes, the larger market schools may have an advantage to draw the better players.
But isn't that really what's happening now? I mean, couldn't you argue that that's kind of a prelude? What's occurring now? What you just said, sort of the death throes of the Big East and the emergence of the new Big East. That all has to do with television money. That all has to do with the major source of revenue. And how do I get more? And so the event, you could argue that, how do I get more? I get better teams, and we all get in one league, and then I get some other, and we have a World Series at the end, or something like that.
Well, sure,
So-
but if you have a salary cap, though, and you're in a bigger market, you can pay more than a smaller market team. So again, does that take away from the parity? And maybe we don't have parity now, but you look at the NCAA tournament, and you still have those big upsets. If you're paying, and those smaller schools have to pay at, let's say, the lower end of the cap, how does that affect the competition base?
Yeah, I mean, again, the follow-up on the conferences, again, it's like Roger said, it's become a money grab. And what these conference schools have, what it is, it's a huge game of musical chairs, right? I mean, these schools are just not wanting to be the last one without a chair. So, Maryland and Rutgers go to Big Ten, and Pittsburgh and Syracuse to the ACC, and just don't want to be left. You don't want to be left behind because the money's there and it's going to go away. In other words, the ESPNs of the world are not going to go after who's left. So we are heading towards these super conferences because that's where the money is. The question that drills down to what we're talking about is how does that affect the players? Well, the players are going to go to where the money is, even though they don't get the money, because it's the exposure of these big conferences. And again, we're back to the fundamental question of everybody making money off these players except themselves.
Yeah, structure would be interesting. You can also think of it such as European soccer. and leagues, teams that get relegated. So could you have one conference, but you get relegated up or down to 3 or 4 different tiers based on how you perform? Don't know if it could ever happen, but if you're talking about a super conference, who's in it and who's not, and if you're getting better, how do you move up into that conference?
So if we're going to have I'm going to jump right ahead. If we're going to have 2 super conferences, do you foresee a time when there's not going to be an NC2A?
I don't, ask me these questions. I don't know. I mean, I know we're not supposed to say that at ESPN, but I don't know. I think it's hard for me to imagine in the same way people keep talking about it. I'm immersed right now in football and concussions and the NFL and concussions, and that whole issue is all I've been living for about a year now. And people ask all the time, well, when's, is the future of this the death of the NFL? And to me, that concept is unfathomable. So in the same way, the concept the NCAA is going to go away seems an unfathomable thought to me. Is it going to change dramatically? It would seem so. Although again, we're in some ways we're in the infancy of this as we see these very critical lawsuits now playing out over the course the next year or 2 years or 3 years. And I guess it's conceivable. If the NCAA wins all these cases, what does change? Are we going to end up with the status quo, or and people will still be arguing again? I mean, I had this conversation 30 years ago, with colleagues about whether you should pay college athletes or not, and whether their tuition was enough. And so I in that way, the conversation is exactly the same as it was. There's just more money at stake, and it's much more clear that the athletes are being exploited. So whether that means the NCAA goes away as an institution or not is hard for me to imagine. But it's also hard for me to imagine, given the groundswell of understanding of what it is to be a college athlete now, and how much more litigation there is that seems to be at least getting some traction, that things don't change in some sort of dramatic way over time.
Andrew?
I think there will be change. Again, I agree with Mark. It's hard to see that sea change we're talking about. Just like the football discussion about concussions, the death of football. I don't see that any way, shape, or happening. And it's like, we say these things all the time. Like, I see my kids playing soccer. Well, soccer's the sport of the future. Well, they were saying that 50 years ago. They're saying that 25 years ago. They're saying that 10 years ago because all the kids play soccer. I think that college athletics is going to continue to build money-wise. So where's the tipping point? Is it going to be litigation? Is it going to be injuries? Again, the injuries suffered in Louisville the other day had such a national reaction. And just even me on Twitter, just so many questions from people who never thought about this. What's the injury liability of Louisville? Not just now, but later. What if he's having complications with his compound fracture in 20 years? I never thought about it, right? And how many thousands of Kevin Wares are there that we don't focus on? So it's kind of these kind of talks that we're having right now. These awareness issues keep bubbling up to like, wow, what's being done about these players? So the more of that is going to lead to more change.
All right, now's a good time that I should ask and see if there's any, in the earlier panels, I was handed questions. I guess we don't even qualify for handed questions. Anyway, are there some questions? Yes.
I would argue that as college sports has developed into a multi-billion-dollar industry, that the athletes have in turn benefited over that development. I mean, now you see these athletes have exclusive access to these incredible training facilities, flat-screen TVs, and video games. You know, it's free issue here between the jackets and sweatshirts and hats and shoes and all this clothing. And I can't believe no one's even mentioned the celebrity status that they have not only in their communities, but now with the TVs nationwide, things that they never had back in the good old days when there's only a couple games on TV, that no other students have at these universities. And on top of that, they still get this free education that they can utilize as much or as little sometimes as they want. So how would you guys respond to that?
Well, go ahead and respond, and then I'll respond.
Well, I think Andrew actually has touched on that a little bit by talking about the exposure, and I have as well, is that part of what an and I'll have to put my contracts hat on so all you want else watch it, is that, part of what we're talking about for compensation and payment is, of course, this exposure being put on this national platform of celebrity, and that is a potential to launch you. And the human being will do that at a lower wage in order to go to the next level. You are never more productive as a lawyer, for example, for all the law students out there, than in your second to fourth year. And then you are underpaid. There's no question you are grotesquely underpaid for the value that you add. But we don't ask for equal distribution of the income stream for the partners are receiving off of you to that. There's a leveling over time of the income. And so here it's almost like you're paying for your internship, and that's why they get you a low rate. It's because a lot of people would like to have that exposure. And so arguably, market forces are in some way there. They're limited by the NC2A, but they're kind of there in that, you'll try to get to the place where you'll get the highest exposure, right? Because that's exactly the compensation you're looking for. So I do think it's kind of already in there in where high players will select to be, where those kind of compensations are highest. Because those non-tangibles, of course, substitute for cash. So I do think it's we've already kind of talked about it a little bit, right?
I would argue this, that everything you say is certainly correct, but I would argue that the reason that there are all the things that you describe is so that the university can get players to come and play athletics in a model in which they don't have to pay them. And what they do is invest in capital investments, long-term investments like that, and trade those kinds of enticements to get better talent. You're right. There is they do get those kinds of things which you described. I just don't think it's fair to equate, long-term capital investments with the benefits and the incredible amount of money that the university makes with what the compensation is for the athletes. It's just my opinion. Yes, sir.
Seems to be central to underlying what a lot of this talking about is that education, the education we're talking about is a sham. I went a few years ago to Rice when I taught. 50th anniversary, football team comes out. President of this, surgeon there, senior partner law firm. Rice really educates people. They got something. What about baseball? Football, there are minor leagues. That's why that's a model. Baseball, you go to minor leagues. You can play semi-pro, or you can directly sign up for the pros if you're good enough. Going to college is an alternative among several. And finally, one other thing I wanted to say, and I'm not a sports person, but I'm just gobsmacked that you aren't talking about insurance. Every college requires every student to have health insurance already. Some of you buy a $100 million policy with $1 million deductible for 22-year-old kids. That's really cheap. It just doesn't cost much to buy insurance to cover, so this one kid who makes that time, it's a terrible accident. Well, hospitals deal with broken legs and combat fractures every day. It's just not a big deal.
All right, let me read a question that's come to us. If cable/satellite providers ever go to an a la carte model, and people who don't watch sports stop subsidizing those who do, what becomes of the leagues and conferences if the money's not there?
Well, for the RSNs that are carrying, let's say, the certain conferences, that's typically more of a tier type model, not a basic type model. So you're not going to, even if it goes a la carte, again, we're talking about carriage, and is someone going to pay a premium on their cable bill for that carriage? So, there may not be a real big impact there because in some degree it's already a la carte. Now, a lot of people, have talked over and over again about the larger networks. You can talk about an ESPN, and if that goes a la carte, and what would be the effect there, the question is, would it ever become à la carte? Don't know the answer there, but I'm sure there's a lot of lobbyists in Washington, D.C. They're going to try to prevent that as much as possible across the board. And it's not just the sports networks, it's other premium channels that are receiving premium affiliate fees. So the question is, I don't know in the near term if we're really going to get to that à la carte type model.
Just to be clear, à la carte means that when you order your cable or your antenna, you have to order, when you order the basic package, you get all kinds of things that you may or may not be interested in. Most of the time you're not. À la carte would mean you get to pick what you want and you don't have to get all of these other ones that are bundled with it. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. One more question, I saw some hands. Yes, sir.
Well, just a suggestion. I think the idea that colleges will universally pay students is not really the issue because, again, as I mentioned earlier, Title IX is going to absolutely stop that. The federal statute, no matter what the university thinks is a great idea, resources are going to have to be distributed equally among genders. So the question really, is not about paying college athletes, it's about allowing college athletes to be paid essentially by third parties. And that's a different question. That's the real problem with the ways, is that they have a rule for giving outside benefits. And, music majors can give less than some money, right? They get more than college. The athletes say, we don't want you to pay us, let us earn money in the 3 hours you give us by, or something like that. It's a different thing, but, if that happens, the university has to worry about that line, money from a separate source, and the school not going to be paying.
Okay, I think this ends our final panel. Thanks to my panelists, and thank you very much for coming. Professor Weston?
Thank you, Roger, and this was a terrific panel. I want to thank all of the speakers who participated today, and Professor Larson, Professor Cossack for doing double duty, the moderators, and also to the Law Review, Mike Wood, congratulations, amazing job. We've learned a lot today. As Kathy told us, we are the NCAA. We are not all the BCS, and we're not all in the big money, although we want to get there, don't we? We learned that television killed amateurism, but television is what drives the machine. There are so many lessons that we've learned today, and the discussion continues. So the future of college sports is exciting. Speaking of exciting, I want to announce the students in my competitions. And as you go out, you'll see that we're working on developing the Sports and Entertainment Dispute Resolution Project here at Pepperdine. We have, I know, Dan Boyson and Eli Melamed went to the final championship round at Fordham's NBA basketball negotiation competition. We have Dan Parrott, Joe Franzi, David Meals, who won the SABR, the Society of American Baseball Research Analytics competition. We have Amanda Fletcher, Carrie Ritchie, who participated in the Southwestern negotiation competition. We need to support our student athletes. We need to support our students. So I thank each of you for being here today, for taking the time and being with us all day. And drive safely. And I think you'll be doing something tomorrow night. What will that be? There, we got more basketball. Okay. Thank you very much.